Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty interesting. It's this intersection of prayer, often seen as personal, and how it's presented in these sources you shared as, well, a strategic element for mission effectiveness.
Exactly. Yeah.
Our goal is really to dig into these texts, get a handle on the core ideas, and understand how they're proposing that intentionally weaving prayer into strategy can actually give a real edge.
Yeah, it's a fascinating argument they make. It's not just prayer on the sidelines, separate from the actual work.
Right.
They frame it as much more fundamental, almost like the breath of God. That's a phrase they use that can really influence and guide the mission strategy.
The breath of God, okay.
Yeah, we'll look at how they see it as like a foundational blueprint, a catalyst for change, and even this unseen power source driving impact.
Okay, great. So we're hunting for those practical frameworks, maybe some aha moments, right?
Yeah.
How this integration leads to missions that are more resilient, adaptable, and ultimately successful.
That's the plan.
We'll touch on specific applications, maybe the pitfalls of not doing this, and hopefully some really compelling real-world stories. Okay, let's unpack it.
Sounds good.
So these sources, they consistently present prayer as foundational, not an add-on. You mentioned this powerful image, the breath of God in strategic action. Where does that idea really come from?
Well, it's interesting how they root it biblically. They go right back to Genesis, God breathing life into Adam.
Right.
And the idea there is that this breath isn't just air. It's like a transfer of divine essence, of intention. Then they connect that to prophecies like in Isaiah and visions in Revelation, suggesting this breath also signifies this personal transformative power for believers.
So prayer becomes more than just saying words. It's tapping into that life force.
That's the concept, yeah. It's seen as an active invocation, calling that divine energy, that life force, into the plans themselves.
And it's not just personal empowerment, you said. It's strategic direction, too. It's a blueprint.
Exactly. That's the other key piece. They argue it functions as a strategic blueprint. Through this ongoing conversation with God, divine wisdom gets imparted, our own vision gets, recalibrated to his purposes.
Right.
And our actions get infused with this, what they call heavenly insight. So it's not just praying before planning, it's the foundation the plan is built on.
Okay, that's a significant framing. So if prayer is this foundational blueprint, how do we actually, weave it into mission strategy? Do the texts offer a practical framework for that?
They do, yeah. And it's pretty practical. They seem to outline sort of a three-part framework.
Okay.
The first part is about cultivating what they call a heart of discernment.
A heart of discernment.
Yeah, so prioritizing humility, openness, making space for reflection, solitude, communal prayer. The key question really shifts.
How so?
It moves from, what can we do, which is very action-focused.
Right, to default.
To a more receptive, what is God saying? It's a fundamental shift from just dictating plans to trying to discern a larger direction.
That shift in questioning seems really key. It's about listening first. So how practically do they suggest cultivating this discernment?
Well, they give concrete examples, things like regular retreats or dedicated prayer sessions focus purely on discerning God's will for the mission.
Okay.
And also setting up mentorship or discernment groups, places where people can process together what they feel they're hearing.
So intentionally creating time and structure for listening. Makes sense. What's the second part of the framework?
The second element is what they call prayer-infused planning and decision-making.
Okay.
This means taking every piece of the strategy, fundraising, resources, community engagement, all of it, and actually looking at it through the lens of prayer.
So it's not just a quick prayer at the start and then back to business as usual.
Exactly. It's about intentionally pausing at critical points in the planning process and seeking, divine confirmation or maybe even redirection.
How would that look in practice, like in a meeting?
They suggest things like dedicated prayer review sessions before finalizing any big plans, where the team specifically prays over each part. And also literally embedding moments of prayer into meeting agendas. Not just an opening prayer, but prayer as part of the discussion.
That could really change the dynamic of a planning meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, and the third part of this framework?
The final element is empowerment through the Spirit. The idea here is that a mission guided by this breath of God needs to be flexible, adaptable.
Right, not rigid.
Yeah. Instead of just sticking to the plan no matter what, teams learn to be responsive to what they perceive as these subtle movements or guidance from the Spirit.
And this is fueled by ongoing prayer.
Constantly. Ongoing prayer helps realign strategies with emerging needs or, what they see as divine opportunities opening up.
So staying nimble, guided in real time. How did that look practically? Any examples?
They suggest things like establishing real-time prayer centers, maybe a dedicated team, or just a focus within the organization that's interceding as things unfold. And also building in feedback loops, where prayerful reflection periodically shapes necessary adjustments to keep the mission dynamic and responsive.
This framework sounds really comprehensive. It goes from the heart posture of listening to planning to adapting in action. Now, you mentioned the sources also have some compelling real-world examples, these breath-fueled missions. Can you share some that stood out?
Absolutely. These stories really help make it concrete. One was about a mission team. They were facing really significant cultural misunderstandings, lots of setbacks.
Yeah, that sounds tough.
Yeah, and it was through this period of intense collective prayer that they had this profound shift in perspective.
What changed?
They started seeing the challenges not just as roadblocks, but actually as opportunities for deeper connection and relationship. By reorienting their whole strategy through prayer, they moved from a kind of transactional approach to one based on genuine partnership and respect, and it apparently turned the whole mission around.
Wow. So prayer actually shifted their viewpoint on the problems themselves.
Exactly. It shows how prayer can lead to that kind of perspective shift, seeing challenges differently.
That's powerful. What other examples did they share?
Well, there were also examples from urban ministries. Some revitalized their outreach by setting up prayer circles within the neighborhoods they serve.
Oh, interesting. Not just the team praying, but involving the community.
Right. It shifted prayer from being just a private thing to a communal strategic tool.
Well,
And that seemed to foster trust, build support, and led to more sustainable community development.
so prayer became a catalyst for connection itself. Were there examples on a bigger scale, maybe global?
Yes, definitely. They highlighted Wymanships.
Youth with a mission.
Right. They described their whole approach as navigating the nations by the wind of the Spirit.
Right.
So before they even enter a port, they do specific intercession for that place. They have what they call divine strategy sessions for logistics, like docking and for their messaging. And they maintain a 147 prayer chains for protection. There are stories of impossible access being granted after prayer or divine delays that actually position them for greater impact during a crisis.
So prayer is seen as influencing even logistics and timing. That's quite a claim.
It is. It suggests they see prayer as actively shaping the operational side of things.
Any other global examples?
They also point to Operation World.
Oh, yeah, the prayer guide.
Exactly. As a global movement mobilizing informed strategic prayer, providing that detailed info for every nation. Many leaders credit it as a catalyst for revival and church growth in places like Mongolia, Nepal, Iran.
So informed prayer is spiritual groundwork on a massive scale.
That's the idea, preparing the way, spiritually speaking, even before people arrive.
What about more local grassroots stuff?
Oh, some fascinating examples there. Church planting movements in South Asia, East Africa, the Middle East.
Okay.
They often talk about this pattern of prayer saturation happening before any explicit evangelism.
Prayer saturation, what does that involve?
Things like villagers praying over every home in an area, community-wide fasting, something they call prayer evangelism.
Prayer evangelism.
Yeah, basically engaging people through offering to pray for their needs first. And they report this often leads to dreams, visions, divine encounters, people becoming interested because of a spiritual hunger seemingly ignited by the intercession.
Wow.
There was one specific story from an East African village. A 40-day focused prayer effort apparently led to an elderly man converting after a significant dream, which then opened the door for house churches to start.
That's incredible. It's like prayer softening the ground, opening doors.
Yeah.
Any other stories that really stick out?
Yeah, Project Uplift was another one. It started as purely practical outreach in a marginalized community,
Right.
but then they shifted. Prayer became a daily rhythm. Team members started praying with residents, setting up prayer stations, doing what they called spirit-led intercession during home visits.
And there was
Reports of spiritual healing, restored marriages, tangible community transformation. Then there's the Frontier Missions Fellowship. They emphasize things like prayer mapping.
prayer mapping, like on a mass.
Yeah, visually mapping an area and praying strategically over it. Also, territorial intercession, prophetic discernment before going into difficult regions.
Okay.
They shared an example from a Himalayan village. A global prayer network did 90 days of targeted intercession before the team arrived. And this timing coincided with an earthquake and a local elder having a significant dream,
Whoa.
which apparently opened doors for the team and led to a house church being planted.
These examples are really striking. It paints prayer as much more than just wishful thinking, but as an active force. Now, the sources also seem to push beyond prayer as just asking for stuff.
Yeah.
Right? They talk about strategic insight, even spiritual warfare.
Right, that's a key distinction they make. It's a more active role for prayer.
How so?
Well, first, it's presented as a tool for actively seeking divine strategy. Not just asking for help, but engaging in a proactive conversation, listening deeply to gain, cultural insights, contextual awareness from God's perspective.
Okay, seeking the plan.
Then there's the spiritual warfare aspect, acknowledging that mission work often faces opposition challenges.
Okay.
Prayer in this sphere is how you gain spiritual discernment to understand those dynamics and engage spiritually, both defensively and offensively.
Engaging spiritually.
And finally, prayer is seen as the conduit for empowerment, for the Holy Spirit's anointing, giving boldness, love, compassion, the actual power needed to see lives changed.
So seeking the plan, engaging the spiritual realities, receiving empowerment, that's definitely more dynamic than just a list of requests.
Yeah.
Now, the sources also critique that tendency towards mission first, prayer later. What problems do they see with that approach?
Yeah, they're pretty critical of prioritizing human intellect or worldly analysis over seeking divine guidance first.
What are the downsides?
Well, several things. One is just over-relying on our own limited wisdom, which means potentially missing unique insights God might offer.
Makes sense.
Another is spiritual dryness, burnout, trying to do it all in your own strength. Also, missed opportunities, unseen pathways that prayer might have illuminated. And finally, a lack of resilience when challenges hit, because there isn't that spiritual foundation or fortification. They even reference Proverbs, diligence needing wisdom beyond our own.
Right, trying to build without that solid base.
Yeah.
So the alternative is to flip that paradigm, integrate prayer from the very start.
Exactly. That's the core message. Shift the view. See prayer not as secondary, but as the source of divine strategy.
Okay.
Prioritizing it from the outset is seen as cultivating spiritual resilience, fostering that partnership with the divine, leading to plans that are more dynamic, adaptable, essentially co-authored with God.
Co-authored with God.
Yeah, and they point to Jesus' example, right? His frequent retreats for prayer, as Luke mentions, as the model for staying aligned.
So it's moving from doing mission for God, after we've planned it, to doing mission with God, letting prayer shape the plan itself.
Okay, so how do we actually do this? The sources offered some kind of blueprint for action, right? Practical frameworks.
Yes, they get quite specific, offering step-by-step frameworks. It often kicks off with what they call foundational prayer.
Before the planning even starts.
Right. Groundwork. Things like vision casting through prayerful discernment, forming the team with a prayer covenant, even doing an environmental scan through prayer walks, literally praying over the area, seeking God's initial direction.
Laying that spiritual groundwork first. Okay, what comes after that?
Then there's often this phase they call the listening phase, a dedicated period before the usual strategic planning.
Listening phase.
Yeah, involving immersive prayer lament, confession, just perceptive listening, plus biblical research related to the context, and team discernment, sharing what people are sensing.
And the goal of that. Often it culminates in producing a listening report, something that captures the collective impressions, the biblical insights, any recurring themes that came up.
So a deliberate pause to really try and hear collectively before jumping into making plans. What happens once you have that report?
Then you move into prayer-infused planning. Taking those insights and intentionally weaving prayer into the actual strategic planning process. Cultivating attentiveness to God's bigger story, developing specific prayer objectives tied to mission goals, prayerfully considering resource mobilization, even doing like a prayer-infused SWOT analysis, looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats through that prayerful lens.
So prayer informs the SWOT analysis. Interesting.
Yeah, and the output is a mission strategy document that explicitly shows how prayer shaped the plan.
So prayer isn't just a side note, it's documented as an input. Okay, what about execution when the mission is happening?
That leads to prayer-driven execution. Establishing a daily rhythm of prayer, maybe strategic prayer campaigns for specific initiatives, ensuring prayer covering, ongoing intercession during activities.
Prayer covering.
Yeah, real-time support. Having a crisis prayer response plan, building in accountability and reflective pauses, those stop, look, listen moments, and keeping something like a prayer journal.
So prayer is an active, ongoing part of daily operations, providing support and course correction. What's the final stage?
The final stage is prayerful reflection and evaluation. Looking back,
Okay.
Post-activity prayer and debriefing together. Doing impact assessment that goes beyond just numbers, looking for spiritual testimonies, shifts. And integrating that reflection into the team's culture for continuous learning and spiritual growth.
So it's cyclical. Prayer informs the start, guides the doing, and shapes the learning for the future.
Got it. Now, you mentioned one source had an interactive exercise for designing a prayer strategy. What kind of prompts were in that? Sounds useful. Yeah, it was really practical for building that prayer infrastructure. It starts by asking you to identify the primary need you're addressing, but then digs deeper. What are the spiritual roots of that need?
Okay. Deeper than the surface problem.
Right. Then it asks you to anticipate challenges, not just practical ones, but potential spiritual resistance, referencing Ephesians 6.
Spiritual warfare again.
Yeah. And identifying specific scriptures that resonate with the mission, giving it that biblical anchor. Crucially, it asks how you'll build in a listening phase.
Back to that listening point.
Definitely. Then it gets practical. Who will be on your intercessory team? Who's committed to praying? Thinking about tools for consistent focus, like prayer calendars or set times, like Daniel.
Okay.
How will you regularly stop, look, listen for alignment? It even suggests defining SMART prayer goals, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, referencing James about asking with intention.
SMART goals for prayer. That's specific.
It is. And thinking about tools like prayer walks, WhatsApp groups, fasting, how to foster a prayer culture in the team, modeling it, storytelling, and finally, how will you measure the impact? Looking for answered prayers, spiritual shifts, testimonies.
Wow, that sounds like a really comprehensive checklist for anyone wanting to be intentional about this. Okay, so the sources wrap up with this idea of a symphony of heaven and earth. Can you unpack that imagery?
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to summarize the whole thing. It emphasizes prayer isn't just a tactic. It's like this divine invitation to join in a harmony between heaven and earth. We're positioned as instruments in the hands of the master musician, referencing John 15. Prayer becomes the way we tune into divine guidance, gain discernment, receive empowerment, find unity, engage spiritually.
The symphony?
Exactly. Missions, in this view, become a form of participatory worship. And the lasting impact doesn't come from our cleverness, but from that breath of God, with prayer as the rhythm of dependence.
Moving from mission for God to mission with God.
That's the heart of it, through prayer.
That's a really powerful way to frame it. Okay, as we bring this deep dive to a close, what are the main takeaways you think our listeners should hold on to from these sources?
Well, I think there are a few key things. First, prayer isn't passive prep work. It's presented as an active, strategic element vital for mission success.
Okay. Active and strategic.
Second, integrating it at every stage, vision, planning, execution, evaluation, really fosters resilience, clarity, and deeper impact.
Integration is key.
Third, those real-world examples show the tangible power prayer is seen to have overcoming obstacles, opening doors, transforming communities. It's not just theory.
The stories matter.
Fourth, that shift beyond just asking to really listening and seeking divine strategy, that's crucial.
Listening. Got it.
And finally, there are practical frameworks and tools available. People can actually use these ideas to intentionally weave prayer into whatever they're doing, big or small.
Excellent summary. Really insightful stuff. Now, as we wrap up, what's one provocative thought you'd want to leave our listener mulling over?
Maybe this. Consider that unseen engine of prayer in the areas you care about most. What might genuinely shift if you intentionally prioritized seeking that divine guidance, that intercession, before you jumped into action? What impossible situations might just see a breakthrough if approached with that kind of strategic, spirit-led prayer?
That's definitely something to chew on. Powerful question. We've really only scratched the surface today. There's so much depth in these sources. Yeah. We definitely encourage listeners to reflect on those frameworks, maybe think about that listening phase, and perhaps revisit some of those case studies. You might even try designing your own mission-focused prayer strategy using those prompts we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'd love to hear from you, our listeners, your thoughts, your experiences. Have you seen prayer work in unexpected ways? What challenges or opportunities do you see in integrating it more strategically? Connect with us. Share your insights.
Please do.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope it's giving you some valuable insights and maybe a fresh perspective on the strategic power of prayer. Until next time.